Good evening and welcome to another episode of Law and Order. And on today's Order of Business, we will be focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on employment. We will be discussing the impediments and challenges risen as a result of COVID-19 in terms of employment, and more importantly, on how we can overcome these challenges. To talk about all of these issues with us, we have an expert in the house. He's a state counsel, former Director General of Employers Federation of Ceylon, senior legal counsel with experience in labor law, industry relations and employment, attorney at law, Kanishka Veerasinghe. A very good evening to you, sir, and welcome to Law and Order.
Thank you, Gihan, and I would like to thank ChannelEye and Tushan and all of the team for inviting me to for this program. Thank you very much.
So as we know, this pandemic has engulfed the entire world. It doesn't matter where you come from, what you are or what you do. Everyone is affected by this pandemic, and not just on economic grounds, on social grounds as well. We've seen this pandemic engulfing all facets of society. And we've seen new variants coming up as well, like Delta, Epsilon and Lambda in different parts of the country. The virus itself is evolving, and we see the impact of it is evolving as well.
Right.
Now, when we focus on employment, what are the biggest impacts of COVID-19 on employment?
Thank you for that question, Gihan, because employment has to be understood. It's not only about law, the legal framework, because we are talking about people, employers as well as mainly employees. You are dealing with people and how they get about and how they are, and you talk about their livelihoods and about their concerns. So the impact on employment, I can tell you that the pandemic is an unprecedented event, and at the commencement we didn't, most of us didn't know what to do about it, even at the policy making level, and especially the reactions that had to be taken, because this was a severe health crisis and it's a continuing health crisis. We have to be mindful of that, and you and I are today wearing these masks in a hidden form, and we are talking about it. I mean, whilst maintaining health protocols, that's how important things are in maintaining that. So that has also contributed to certain restrictions, and this had a severe impact in relation to employment. And I can say that when things emerged initially in that was way back in March, when the first lockdowns were imposed, I think it was the 24th of March, we had very little indication of what was to come. Suddenly the government had to impose these lockdowns because of the health conditions, and people had to abide strictly by these conditions, but at the same time that had a severe economic impact on the country, and that was the same around the world and the region. In Sri Lanka, I was the Director General of the Employers Federation at that time, the largest employer body in this country. And I can tell you that I also had to give direction to not only our members but the employers in general, because that was our status. And I had to engage with the government and my colleagues in the trade unions who are representing employees, as well as other institutions like the agencies that maintain law and order, especially the police and the health ministry and so on, because we had to coordinate and understand. But that took some time initially. And if I am to sort of talk about the legal side of things, that also put a lot of pressure, because the lockdowns meant that the fundamental obligation of offer of work by the employer and the offering of themselves for work by the employees could not take place, because that's the basis of a contract of employment. So these two obligations could not be, I would say, continued for reasons beyond the control of both parties, because the lockdown was imposed due to by the government due to a health situation, but at the same time the parties were unable to carry out their obligations which they are contractually obliged to do. And it gave rise to a legal situation, a principle, where if this situation were to continue, we would have even had a situation where parties could have considered the contract of employment to be at an end due to supervening circumstances and a situation called frustration. But that didn't take place, and employers and also the EFC at the time didn't go to look at those legal implications, but rather we focused on retaining employees and as much as possible sustaining our businesses at the same time, and also their livelihoods. because I can clearly remember when a special task force was formulated as a reaction to this issue. That was a ministerial task force headed by the then Minister of Labour, Mr. Dinesh Gunawardena. He invited us also to be part of it, and the trade unions, and we discussed the implications at length, and the Commissioner General at that time presented a initial summary of a survey that had been carried out on the impact of the pandemic on the private sector, and it was not good. We were actually looking at unemployment something at the rate of maybe 20–30% if the situation were to continue, and it was not good. And a survey carried out by the Employers Federation also reflected the same things. But the EFC survey also brought about certain sentiments of the employers, where for instance they were to give priority to retain employees. They were to give priority to sustain the livelihoods of employees while sustaining their businesses. So this was a sentiment that was somewhat different from the region and most parts of the world, where the employers themselves took an initiative to look after the employees and to try and do their best to retain employees. But there were many challenges. For instance, the fact that employees didn't report to work or could not report to work also resulted in a dilemma for employers, because they didn't know whether to set off employee leave, because as you know, if an employee doesn't come to work, he or she should offer an explanation. Here we know that the situation is due to the lockdowns, and the employees, many of the employees actually contacted the employer and say, look, we can't come because there was no public transport and there were restrictions imposed, and we knew that many of them couldn't come because of this issue. But at the same time, the employers had to pay wages, or they grappled with the question as to whether they should pay wages, because this was a situation where the employees didn't come, and employers also could not offer employment because of the same reason. So legally there was a situation where they could have said, we are not going to pay wages. But I am happy to note that after lengthy discussions with at different levels, as well as at the policy making level at the EFC, we took a decision that we will continue to abide by those our principles of paying wages. But at the same time, we discussed this matter at the highest level and came up with a formula, because there was no law applicable at that time, because the law says, look, if an employee comes to work, you have to pay wages. But here was a situation where the employer could not operate and the employee could not come to work, and where is the obligation to pay wages then? But at the same time, because of the sentiment that employers had to retain employees as much as possible and to continue to support their livelihoods, we also thought that it was a good employment practice to try and see whether we could come to some understanding at the national level and come up with a formula where we could also sustain ourselves rather than just paying wages, but at the same time contribute something to the employees so that their livelihoods can be continued. So that resulted in what is now known as the National Agreement to Prorate Wages, where we agreed to pay 14,000 rupees or 50% of salaries of employees when they could not come to work due to COVID. Of course, they had to inform the employer. That was a very special situation, and this agreement was also hailed internationally by the international organizations, including the International Labour Organization, international unions, and also the EFC's international affiliate, the IOE, the International Organization of Employers. So this was a good practice, but the problem is this situation continued. It continues today as well, and people are grappling with the situation where unlike in other parts of the region, now in India they relaxed 52 labour laws, both federal as well as state laws relating to employment, which enable businesses to have some relief with their payments of wages and things like that. But in Sri Lanka we didn't have any of that. We continue with the same laws, and this has actually resulted in certain labour law experts who were appointed recently by the Ministry of Labour to look at labour law reforms, also discussing as to whether the Commissioner General should be empowered of course through discussion with the social partners, the tripartite partners, whether he should have some kind of mechanism to decide on these matters, maybe to delay EPF, ETF remittances, maybe the ad hoc agreement that we came into about prorating wages, whether that type of thing mechanism could be sort of put in to a more sort of solid form by having a regulation or something like that, so that there is a balance of things where you sustain businesses as well as employment, because businesses, as you know, didn't have any income. Some industries have not recovered. The tourism hospitality sector is can be cited as an example. It's all over the same around the world for that sector, unfortunately, and it continues. Now even today we are having a health situation where employers have to strictly abide by health guidelines when employing their personnel, and employees themselves have to follow certain strict health guidelines when they come to work. So again we might have to go back to the drawing board and see how best we can actually handle this situation, because I fully agree when people say that the economy has to go on, otherwise we are not going to go anywhere. But at the same time we have to understand that we have to support the health authorities in maintaining all the possible health protocols and adhere to the health protocols strictly. And this is a message that I would like to ask all employees to adhere and employers to adhere, because without this we will not be able to carry out our economic activities in the future, because I think this health situation will be there for some time, unfortunately. But having said that, we can't just ignore our obligations towards society to carry out our economic activities, carry out employment, and we need to support the state to carry out its activities, and otherwise society, there can be chaos in society. So I think there are reciprocal obligations that we have to meet. These are some of the things that I would like to initially mention.
With regard to what you just mentioned, we realize that there are certain professions or certain job descriptions where you can't basically work from home. You need to physically report to work to get the job done. Yeah. So be it the private sector or the public sector, in a situation like that, the employer, from the employer's perspective, what is the course of action they can take, given that the employees can't report to work? Does that result in the contractual obligations being null and void? How does it really apply?
Yeah, this is the principle I mentioned earlier. Technically, yes, you can, if the inability continues on the part of the employee to report to work because of lockdowns, and which is a situation which the employee is not it's a situation beyond the control of employers. There is a possibility that the employer could consider the contract to be at an end due to supervening circumstances and frustration. But having said that, that's the reason why as a responsible organization, as a responsible employers in this country thought no, they should do something slightly differently, right? And that's the reason for the prorating agreement to come up. Many said there's no law and things like that. We all know there's no law. But one of the first things that what came to my mind, and then I spoke to some of my predecessors as well, was to look at as to what we as lawyers would do if the law is absent, if there's a lacuna in the law, right? I mean, if there's a lacuna in the statutes, and if there's a lacuna in even the decided cases, what do you do? Then it's a case of, it's an opportunity to come up with something new, and that's the time that you actually have to come out of the box, think out of the box and see as to what you can do. And I can tell you that we at the Employers Federation, especially and my colleagues and myself, we took certain principles in relation to a recommendation, very important recommendation that was passed in the ILO in 2017, which are the Jobs for Peace and Reconciliation recommendation 205, where it dealt with how stakeholders should conduct themselves when there is a crisis, when the law itself cannot support society. You have to think out of the box and think of different frameworks. That's why now at a panel discussion yesterday, the experts were talking about empowering the Commissioner General of Labour, taking the example of what we actually did in 2020 in March and April, where the prorating agreement was agreed, and that was actually given an opportunity for employers to apply the agreement to prorate, that's to pay 50% of 14,500 to people whom they cannot get down for work, right? Either they cannot report for work or can't get them down for work, because remember, we also have and had very strict conditions imposed in bringing employees to work. And to answer your fundamental question about manufacturing, now services, as you mentioned quite rightly, employers who were ready were able to offer technological solutions, but then again I can tell you at the initial stages many employers couldn't support that because of the lack of infrastructure, lack of investments they had made in digitalization. Employers who were in certain industries were able to do that, the IT sector and some of the service sector organizations, because they had prepared. Now EFC as an organization, we were prepared because we were linked internally as well as with our members. So we were able to constantly serve our members despite the lockdowns. But that's a service organization, as you quite rightly said. Manufacturing organizations couldn't apply that solution. So that's why we came up with the concept of this agreement to prorate wages, so that employers could justify a payment to employees despite they are not coming to work due to no reason of the employer. These are some of the things that we had to come up, and that's exactly why now today we are thinking of asking whether the Commissioner General and the Department of Labour should be empowered to, after discussion with the tripartite partners, whether they should be having some mechanism to try and address these issues in relation to a crisis. It's not for perpetuation, it's for a crisis whether the Commissioner can say, okay, for this period we will allow employers to delay EPF, ETF remittances. Okay, for this period, as agreed between the tripartite partners, we will pay maybe 40% of wages or 50% or something like that. You see? So that's important, because in a crisis, I mean, this was unprecedented. And employers paid wages despite not having even a single cent coming into their kitty as income. I can even tell you that in the agriculture sector, the plantation companies, the region plantation companies, I can give an example. Now they continued to engage employees and offer work despite the fact that they could not sell their teas or rubber in auctions, because the auctions were all closed. There was no buying internationally, right? But despite those pressures, they actually employed their employees and paid. And that also, although they only have about 150,000 employees altogether, as you know, there are about 1.3 million people living on estates. So that enabled the estate community to sustain a larger community, which went back to the estates from the Colombo. Many of them don't work on estates; they work in Colombo or other places. They went back to their homesteads. But fortunately, the employers, the RPCs, actually offered work and continued to sustain these employee livelihoods. So it's not only about looking at legal principles in a crisis, but you have to do what is practically what is right, and also practically what is sustainable, and to support not only yourselves, your businesses, but also society at large. And also you have to think of, go out of the box and look at your employees.
Definitely. Like you mentioned, these are unprecedented times and you have to be pragmatic and sometimes think out of the box. Now let's talk about the solutions that have been introduced due to this inability to report to work physically. We've seen the private sector implementing work from home and roster basis reporting since 2020. Now we've seen the government implementing this as well. How effective would it be for the public sector? Is the necessary infrastructure in place to facilitate this?
I think it'll be very impossible. I mean, I can tell you that even today, even the private sector, which has access to maybe large amount of funds and infrastructure, we struggle to have some of these systems going, even in situations where we can work, ask people to work from home, but a majority have succeeded in doing that by today. And today a lot of people are investing in digitalization and communication strategies, so that we can, and they are making use of technology in a way that they can perform their services. That's particularly in the service industry. If you talk about the manufacturing, I'm not talking about the manufacturing industry in the private sector. They have also now got used to anyway we used to work on a shift patterns, but the system of reducing employees was something totally new, and that did not we could not manage the numbers and as well as the orders that we had. So that was a struggle for manufacturing companies. It's a struggle even now because of the lockdowns. They can't get down their employees altogether. So these are some things that they have got used to, and it's a constant evolution to look at things and improve productivity and things like that. One thing that is good in the private sector is, I'm not saying it's not there in the public sector, is that we have mechanisms for dialogue with our employees. It's a case of constantly keeping a dialogue with your employees and getting them to agree on certain processes and procedures, particularly to improve productivity, because if you are manning one machine, now I might be manning 1 or 2 machines. So this is something that we saw, and there are a lot of examples from other countries even during normal times. So I think our employees are fully committed in the private sector to support employers. I think they also realize the importance of their livelihoods and sustaining the employer and the institution that they work for. So they also committed themselves. So we see that cooperation there in the private sector. If I am to take the public sector, these are large departments, and the government obviously didn't have the infrastructure to suddenly give everybody an opportunity to work from home or make use of technology. That I'm sure the government is also the funds are limited, and currently there's a financial crisis going on. We have to understand that, but at the same time they are doing their best to facilitate this process, to allow employees to work from home and to sustain their livelihoods. And this is something that I think public servants, of course, they work hard. During the pandemic, we saw the commitment by the health sector as well as other sectors, not only the health sector, now even things like facilities like the RMB and the passport office, how committed they were. So public sector employees have a huge duty to play, but at the same time we see sometimes I have listened to some other TV stories and things like that. Maybe a few have not understood the importance of how important the service that they play towards the public, because I must bow my head to the public servants and for the work that they are doing despite the difficulties. Despite the transport difficulties and things like that, they are committed to their work. But you do have, like in the private sector, you do have a few employees who might not understand the full commitment and the service that they are doing.
Definitely. As employees, we all have a responsibility towards our employer, be it the private sector or the public sector. We need to make sure that we get the job done. It doesn't matter whether you work from home or whether you report to work on a roster basis or on a daily basis. We all have a responsibility to do our best and to support the employers and the country in trying times like this. So with us, we had the former Director General of the Employers Federation of Ceylon, Senior Legal Counsel, who shared his expertise in labour law, industry relations and employment. Attorney at Law Kanshka Veerasinghe, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us today. It was very instrumental to have this discussion on the way forward, especially during these crisis times. So thank you once again for gracing the show.
Thank you, Gihan, and thank you, ChannelEye.